I'm about to tell you something about Charles Manson that you never knew existed. As much information as there is out there about Charles Manson, I personally did not know this story until I just stumbled across it recently. As you all know, Charles Manson was in the Hollywood scene of San Francisco and Hollywood, Los Angeles. He traveled back and forth in that corridor with his followers strumming the guitar and just bumming on the streets. And eventually, Charles Manson gets a following of people together who look at him as if he was the Messiah. I mean, these people literally thought Charles Manson was Jesus. But I think that you already know that. But what I'm about to tell you takes place in the 1960s while in the county jail in Los Angeles. And it has to do with another popular person, Danny Trejo, right here, who was in prison. As you all know, you might know Danny Trejo's story. If you don't know who Danny Trejo is, I'd be surprised. Most people do. He plays in movies like Desperado, Machete, Dusk Till Dawn, just to name some of his better movies. But he was also a boxer. He was a Golden Glove boxer, from what I understand, and he was also involved with street crime. He may never say it. He was never a member of MA, but he was connected with a lot of people who were members of La M.A., which is the Mexican mafia. So he's in prison in the county jail, happens to be on the same tier with Charles Manson. Charles Manson, from according to what Danny Trejo says, is a diminutive fellow. We all know he's a diminutive fellow. Charles Manson is, I believe, to be like 5'6". Danny Trejo says he's like 5'5". And some people wanted to mess with him. And what I believe he meant by mess with him is I think they wanted to punk Charles Manson out. Back in the 1960s, them dudes were trying to take Charles Manson's booty from him. Now, if his booty gets taken from him in the county jail way back then maybe he doesn't go on to have the same influence he does before the Sharon Tate murders in 1969, I think it was. And maybe Sharon Tate's still alive if somebody takes his booty. But Danny Trejo and other people, put Charles Manson under their wing. Now, to no fault of their own, could they predict that Charles Manson would go on to be responsible for the murders of Sharon Tate and those other people? Even though Charles Manson wasn't there, that's another dispute. He never physically harmed anybody. It's all mental games. But when I tell you what he did to prisoners to supply them with narcotics, it will all make sense to you. Welcome to the Pen and the Shank, the most unusual and unique crime and prison channel experience on YouTube, where you're going to get stuff like Charles Manson information that you never knew before. I mean, did you really know that Danny Trejo done time with Charles Manson in the 1960s? In a county jail in Los Angeles? Nah, you probably didn't know that. And when Danny Trejo was telling this story, what makes it so interesting is that Danny Trejo is in a cell, what I'm assuming, even though he doesn't say it, he never comes out and says these things, and I don't blame him because that's just the code of the streets and the code of the prison. But I'm thinking he's in there with some shot callers. He says he's in there with his homie Chato and another homie, and this was 6-man cells, but they only had 3 people in their cell because they were running a tight ship, and they protected Charles Manson, and they had Charles Manson in the front of their cell. They never did let Charles Manson live in their cell, but they kept him in front of the cell because Charles Manson provided them with something that nobody else could provide them with inside the county jail. Charles Manson was the narcotic supplier for Danny Trejo and Chato and the other homie that was in the cell. And Charles Manson kept them getting loaded. And you would think that, all right, well, if Charles Manson was the plug, how come everybody else isn't fighting to get what Charles Manson has, which is the narcotics? Well, the narcotics that Charles Manson had wasn't in physical form. It was spiritual and mental. Charles Manson, little did I know, was a hypnotist. That's right. He was hypnotizing Danny Trejo, and that thunder just clapped. Startled me, got my attention as I'm sitting here talking about crazy Charles Manson and hypnotism. So Danny Trejo is telling this story on how Charles Manson knows how to hypnotize. And that is what I did not know about Charles Manson. I did not know he was a hypnotist. Did you know that Charles Manson was a hypnotist? Share in the comments below if you did. And if you have any experience with hypnotism. I don't mess around with no hypnotism. I don't mess around with no spirit reading. I don't mess around with no cards and no crystal balls. I'm a Christian, so I stay clean away from all that stuff because I believe in spiritual forces. And so I believe that Charles Manson, he was tapping into some spiritual dark forces. And I believe that them demonic forces had Chato and Danny Trejo and the homie up in the cell thinking that they were loaded. And this is per Danny Trejo's words. Of course, I can't play the video because of copyright issues, but Danny Trejo says this on multiple interviews. He says that Charles Manson put us on some heroin. He said when we took the shot of heroin, him and Chato was in the toilet in the sink puking. And he said back when he used to take heroin, he said it would make his eyes puffy and red. He said his eyes got puffy and red, and he nodded out and he fell asleep, and they all knocked out like they were nodding on that dope. You know what I mean? You know how people nod on that stuff. They'd be like drooling, nodded out. So Danny Trejo and the homie, they in there nodded out. They get back up hours later. They look, and Charlie's just sitting there by the front of the cell. And Chato's like, dang, man, that was some good stuff. And Danny's like, man, dang, that was some good dope. But there's one homie, he's like, I didn't feel nothing. And they say, hey, Charlie? And Charlie's like, yeah. He's like, man, look, me and Chato, we had a good high. But how come the homie didn't get nothing? He didn't feel the same thing we felt. What's wrong? You don't know how to operate this thing? And Charles Manson asked the homie, he said, hey, man, you ever shot up heroin before? And the homie was like, nah, I never. And then Charles Manson, like, that's the problem. Charles Manson told him in order for the hypnotism to work, the person has had to experience the thing in which they're going to be hypnotized by. So since Danny Trejo and Chato were dopers and they had shot up that heroin before, it was normal for them to experience the feeling. So when Charles Manson hypnotized them, all he had to do was get them to tap into the part of their brain and their experience in the past to when they actually were nodding out on that dope, to bring them up to current times to where they were nodding out on a dope even though they weren't doing it. So he tapped into the mind. And that's something you always hear, that as humans, we only have tapped into a small amount of our brain potential. Our intellectual potential has only been tapped into a small amount. But I'm going to tell you something else. If we've only tapped into a small amount intellectually, how much more so have we not tapped into the bigger spiritual ramifications? So if we can't open our mind intellectually, how are we going to open our mind and our spirit up to spiritual things? You know, so most people have never seen a supernatural occurrence or a supernatural event. But here we are. We got Danny Trejo talking about he's literally puking. And if you know anything about dope, like I said, one of the signs people said when you get your first shot, you puke or you crap on yourself. That's the first thing. That's how you know that the dope was good. If you take a dump on yourself, they said you know you got a good shot of that dope. That was that good stuff. Well, they puking inside this cell and they don't physically have the heroin. They are using mental heroin through hypnotism from Charles Manson. So the homie says he never did it before. And then Charles Manson lets them know, look, in order for this hypnotism to work, you have had experienced it before. And since he never did it before, I can't make him feel what he never felt. So there were limitations on Charles Manson's ability to hypnotize someone with the feeling of feeling loaded like they did when they did real dope. This stuff is crazy, but this stuff is real. So Charles Manson, like Danny Trejo said, at first they were all, and look, a homie was on the weed. So they were all walking around like they were loaded on that weed. They had them munchies. They were eating them honey buns and them soups. And Charles Manson had them thinking they were high on weed, and everybody did it. But, you know, there was, like I said, there's limitations to what Charles Manson could do. And the more you look back at Charles Manson, man, you see some stuff that's really, it's uncanny, man. There's some eerie stuff that's going on with Charles Manson. He was tapping into some demonic activities. And though he did not officially, legitimately, physically unalive Sharon Tate and the other people that he's responsible for taking their lives, I believe this is proof that he had the power and the ability to make people do things that he wanted them to do. Charles Manson was tapped into some demonic stuff. That's how he can make people feel certain ways and do certain things. He had mental mind control over people. He was like Professor Xavier. He was the villain. That's what I'm saying. He had superpowers. Charles Manson was a real life villain. To deal with a real life villain, you need a real life superhero. And dare I might add, that's going to be somebody who operates on the opposite spectrum of hypnotism. They operate on the spectrum of casting down demons. You can say what you want, but you've seen The Exorcism, though it's a movie and it's over exaggerated and not completely true and made for theatrics and theatrical performances to entertain the viewer. It has some elements of truth. One thing that I always give the Catholic Church credit for, and all their flaws, and there's no shortage of flaws in the Catholic Church. They got some hedonistic things that they're hiding and some disgusting, demented, twisted, perverted stuff that they swept under the rugs that has been exposed over the years. So they got some problems, not to mention some of the other religious issues and theological issues that I have problems with the Catholic Church. And I'm from Louisiana, born and raised as a Catholic. They have more Catholics in Louisiana, probably than the rest of the world almost. Anyway, Southern Louisiana. What I'm saying is that the one thing the Catholic Church did good was exorcisms. And that's how you get movies like The Exorcism. And there was another movie recently with Russell Crowe where he played the father. This was based on a true story. Now, if you go watch the real interviews with the father who actually casted those demons out, you could see that they made it theatrical. It was ridiculous what they do for Hollywood. Give us a real life portrayal on how this stuff works. There is no shortage of exorcisms and stories of exorcisms where demons were cast out of people. So what I'm saying all that to say this, that I believe Charles Manson was operating on the evil side of that spectrum. The priest and the pastors, they exorcise demons and kick them out. Charles Manson, he invokes the power of said demons to take over somebody and make them feel things that they don't really feel, because that's how powerful the brain is, man. The brain has the ability to make you think and feel and see things that you did not. Or maybe it opens up another realm to where you could feel these things and you're actually feeling them, though you did not take on a physical drug. You're feeling the euphoria or whatever feeling you feel from that drug. And that's what Charles Manson did. This stuff is crazy, I know, but this is the pen and the shank. The most unusual and unique crime and prison channel experience on YouTube, where we tap into the most unusual and unique aspects of the crime and prison genre. And this is definitely within that category. Hypnotism of Charles Manson to Danny Trejo. And I believe that if we dig deeper and go down the rabbit holes, we'll unlikely uncover all kinds of people who were hypnotized by Charles Manson, and dare I say, people who he made do things that they did not realize that they were doing, because their mind and their body was underneath the power of Charles Manson and whatever demon that he invoked on them in their lives for them to commit the things that they did. Some people say they don't remember it. No wonder why. Man, give me a like and subscribe and share in the comments. Let's get this conversation going. What do you think about hypnotism? And did you know that Charles Manson had this much power? I'm talking supernatural.